Good evening, this is Benjamin Robert Siegel, and Benjamin is visiting Grandpa Sidney and Grandma Nomi. He's full of sweet potatoes and a little bit of fresh pear, quite a few Cheerios, and a big bottle of formula. I guess you'd say it's milk. Benjamin Robert Siegel was imitating Grandma and pounding on that tray, and the Cheerios were going like that. They were going like that, and he was having fun, and I think we lost a few Cheerios.
Well, it's been about 4 decades, and as it turns out, I still really like Cheerios, even if I don't buy them on a regular basis. In 2021, it's really easy for us to look at industrial food, things that have been processed and refined and transformed from one thing into another, and think of them with a little bit of disdain as something that's kind of below us if we're serious eaters. But industrial foods are part of our everyday life. You probably can't imagine going through life milling your own flour or processing your own chocolate. And you're the beneficiary of thousands of transformations in food industrialization that let you enjoy dishes far away from where they were produced and long after they were made. Cheerios are just one kind of good example of this. They're a product that is deeply processed, transformed from one thing into another, and yet they're still the font of so much nostalgia and different feelings of home. Cereal crystallizes that pretty well. Industrial food has been responsible for a host of sins, including the rise of particular forms of agriculture and industrialization around the world that we might feel kind of uncomfortable about. But at the same time, we really do live in a world that has been made possible by industrial foods. And it's something that we shouldn't look down on, but rather try to understand. That's what we're going to do today. But in the meantime, I'm going to finish this bowl of Cheerios just as good as they were 4 decades ago. Hey everyone, I'm Benjamin Siegel, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. Today we're going to dive deep into some massive and massively important changes that took place in food production in the 19th century. More specifically, we're going to talk about the rise of industrial technologies and the making of completely new types of food. We've talked a lot about turning points before, the Columbian Exchange and the global rise of sugar, for example. But this is certainly among the most important milestones in getting to how we eat today. It's hard to imagine a world where we don't have things like white bread, or a world without easy access to meat or fish, or the convenience that you find in a contemporary grocery store. But keep in mind that before the 19th century, regular access to all of these things would have been an unthinkable and unrealizable fantasy. A while back, we talked about the changes taking place in agricultural production and marketing in the 18th century. By the 19th century, in the Western world and a few other pockets, it was clear that regular starvation was becoming a thing of the past. But it was also at this point that there were suddenly new concerns over the types of foods and the quality of foods that the middle classes in many of these countries were beginning to eat. As industrialization marched forward, it's clear that workers and ordinary people were able to eat better and live longer lives. This took place probably for the first time in the 1840s in Western Europe and a little bit later in the United States. It was in this decade that consumers began eating more staple grains, meat, tea, and sugar. But there's a little bit of a paradox at work here that we're going to try to tease out today. When nutrition did improve for common people, it came at the price of a growing distance between producers and consumers. So that meant that common people were increasingly anxious about the quality or provenance of their food, where it came from and what it was. They were worried about how healthy it was, and companies had to work hard to overcome that skepticism. But they did, and that's the kind of world that we inhabit today. Zoom out a little bit and think about the last time you were in a grocery store. How did you decide what was good to eat and what wasn't good to eat? With some types of food, that's pretty easy. You just look for the apple that looks right, or the piece of fish that's got clear eyes and good-looking skin. But some things are more complicated. Sometimes you have to make judgments about a food that you're going to eat in the future, particularly a fruit or vegetable that came from far away. don't usually buy an avocado or banana with the idea that you're going to eat it that same day, but you think about what it's going to look like in a few days. Then there's other things that you basically don't know anything about if you haven't had them before. What a package of noodles or a bread or crackers might look like, or a soup or some beans that come out of a can. To make decisions about those industrial foods, you've got to look to other signals, things like packaging, brands, marketing. And that's exactly the kind of cultural work that happened in the world of industrial food in the middle of the 19th century. So today we're going to talk about the rise of a few different technologies that all came together within that long century. Let's start out with canning. The idea of preserving food for some future time isn't anything new. It was probably the Chinese who first figured out how to preserve food in salt, making things like salted fish and then things like soy sauce, all of which helped extend the life of perishable but nutritious things. By the 16th century, Europeans had begun to salt cod, and the rise of this fish helped to improve the quality of European diets. But things were changed forever in 1809 with the invention of the can, or at least something like the can. Nicolas Appert was a Parisian confectioner, and he figured out that if you took a given food, sealed it in glass, and then boiled it in a relatively sterile way, you could keep food pretty much indefinitely. The only problem was that glass was heavy, and it could also shatter pretty easily, so it wasn't that durable or convenient. But the British quickly figured out how to do the same process in cans, which were lighter and sturdier. And before long, they were including tinned foods on Navy ships as part of the standard ration for sailors. That kicked off a long trend, not just the canning or tinning of food, but of the military being early adopters of new food technologies. At first, the can was sort of a failure. The costs were pretty high to produce canned food, and there was no really good can opener. Early cans you opened with a hammer and a chisel, so they weren't particularly convenient to use. But it didn't take long for the technology to improve and to take off, and by the 1830s, American and European shopkeepers were regularly stocking tinned fish and meat, and a little bit afterwards, fruits and vegetables. But let's talk a little bit more about the meat that was going into those cans, and that was also starting to appear on diners' plates more and more often in that century. Remember that before the 19th century, meat was a rarity for nearly everyone on planet Earth. People certainly ate meat around the world and with some regularity, but animals were expensive to keep and expensive to slaughter, so people didn't eat meat with every meal, and in most places probably not even every week or month. Meat could be used, as it is in a lot of places, as something of a condiment, so you'd take small amounts of meat or fat and you'd put it in other stews or dishes. But all that began to change in the 19th century thanks to the rise of something new. You probably know about Henry Ford and the invention of the assembly line for automobiles in Detroit, my hometown. But really, that technology owes a lot to pigs, and unfortunately, our rival state, Ohio. In the 1830s, Cincinnati, Ohio became the birthplace of modern meatpacking, which revolved around the specialized distribution of labor. In that city, teams of specialized workers would hack away at the carcass of a freshly killed pig. They'd cut away at a side of an animal to turn it into ham or bacon, and at the end of this kind of gruesome disassembly line, there wasn't anything left. You could then take the meat, pack it in barrels of brine, and ship it out to major coastal cities. At first, this was a seasonal industry. You could only really kill and ship animals in the winter months when it was freezing outside, so that the meat wouldn't decay, spoil, or rot. But by the middle of the century, the railroads had developed, and ice harvesting allowed cold cars to bring pork to the East Coast, even at the height of summer. But that industry soon moved a little bit west. Cincinnati had long been known as Porkopolis, but by the Civil War, Chicago had become America's pig capital, since it had easy access to Midwestern hogs which had been fattened on corn from places like Iowa or Nebraska. In those days, it was pork, and not beef, that was America's meat of choice. America's preference for pork meant that it had a lot more in common with Europeans who were also eating a lot more pig than beef. But all of that was also about to change with another set of technological developments. Let's think a little bit about meat. It's pretty easy to cure pork and to make it palatable long after the pig itself is dead. Preserved pig is something of an art in many places. Think of things like good smoked bacon or charcuterie, thin slices of prosciutto or Chinese sausage. But beef doesn't generally taste so good if you salt and dry it. It turns hard and it doesn't have much taste. You can certainly preserve beef in interesting ways. There's things like the American tradition of beef jerky or Italian bresaola. But mostly, the cattle that were being raised in the 19th century in Texas, Argentina, and Australia were being used for leather. The meat was just left to rot. But after the American Civil War, cowboys began driving longhorn cattle north to places like Abilene, Kansas, which was the head of the railroad. So live cattle were then loaded onto railroad cars and were shipped up north to Chicago. This was the beginning of the modern meat industry. Within a few years, a businessman named George Hammond purchased a patent for a refrigerated railroad car. His first shipment of beef was from Detroit to Boston, two places that happen to be kind of important to me. But before long, Chicago's slaughterhouses began regularly killing cows outside of the city, and then they'd send the finished beef east on refrigerated railroad cars. There were four big players in this industry: Hammond, Swift, Armour, and Morris. And before long, local butchers across the country were unable to compete with the cheap beef that was coming in from Chicago. The only local butchers who could really hold on to their businesses were kosher butchers, since it wasn't possible at that time to slaughter meat according to ritual Jewish practice at a large enough scale. Everything in this moment was beginning to change. And if meat was being remade in the 19th century, grains were as well. In 1842, a new technology was invented which quickly remade the world of cereals. The grain elevator was a big vertical warehouse. Steam-powered conveyor belts poured in grains from the top of the factory, and chutes dropped it into ships or railway cars for transportation. Before this point, grain had been moved by strong men carrying burlap sacks. But now you could take grain, again from the American Midwest, package it, and move it anywhere in the world. And Chicago once again became the center of this industry. Farmers were generally hurt by this development. Their crops became indistinguishable, sold to markets far away. Across the world, wheat prices fell, which was good news for consumers who were able to buy cheap bread, but it was devastating for farmers who grew it. Wheat, rice, and other foods were being remade through the invention of new milling technologies, and what we'd soon come to call refined foods. Before the 1840s, if you wanted to mill wheat or break it down into a bakeable or usable form, you'd use something called a millstone. You'd pound down wheat and get usable wheat, but it would leave behind hulls and oil, and the presence of oil meant that it would rot pretty quickly. It didn't keep for very long. But in the 1840s, there was a new technology invented called the Hungarian roller mill. It rolled the grain inside and it removed the outer layers of wheat bit by bit. The result was white, pure flour, but also flour that would keep for a much longer time. Flour still goes bad, but roller-milled flour tends to stay shelf-stable for much longer periods of time. The same changes were taking place with one of the other big world grains, rice. British engineers were making big changes to rice milling machinery, which meant that European countries could import Asian rice that was unprocessed as raw paddy and mill it in Europe. That was a big benefit for European countries and European industry, but it caused massive deindustrialization in colonial Asian countries in particular. Milling also changed other unexpected industries. In 1828, Dutch inventors created a new press that would take cocoa and remove excess cocoa butter. The result was at first a smoother chocolate for drinking. But before long, it was that development that allowed for the rise of chocolate candies produced in mass. Almost all of these products are arguably less nutritious than their unrefined counterparts. But the world had changed through these new technologies. Ordinary people in many parts of the world were now able to buy products that would have been prohibitively expensive just decades before. We could stop our story here, but let's press on a little bit. In reality, these changes went far beyond the mass production of foods that had once been luxuries. This was also the moment when new foods were being created for the first time, taking advantage of new developments in the scientific method and even just basic chemistry. Humans, as you well know, had been breeding new plants and domesticating them for tens of thousands of years. But in the 19th century, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. Chemists had new understandings of the basic components of food, and so they were beginning to become prepared to create artificial substitutes for existing foods, or to change the chemical or biological composition of others. New discoveries in genetics allowed for an increased pace of change in plant breeding and the dramatic remaking of familiar crops. Since so much of this work was taking place in labs or factories, it also began to move the bulk of the work of food production out of the home and into industrial settings. One of the first of these new foods in the 19th century was a butter substitute that you've undoubtedly had before. Butter was in really short supply in the early modern world, and it was particularly hard to get in growing cities, since it spoiled before it got there from the farm. In 1866, the French government sponsored a competition to find a butter substitute that both the military and the French working classes could use. The chemist Hippolyte Mergemoulier took the basic technique of churning used for butter, but he used it to create a new substitute instead. He mixed together what sounds like an unappetizing mix of beef tallow, skim milk, water, and salt, and he called it oleomargarine. You know it, of course, as margarine. Margarine worked well for many of the things that you previously would have used butter for. But of course, dairy farmers were deeply upset to find out just how popular that cheap butter substitute was. And as the product grew in popularity, those farmers lobbied governments to prevent manufacturers from dyeing margarine yellow. They hoped that a sort of disgusting-looking gray product would help distinguish fake butter from the real thing, but after several decades, that lobbying effort lost steam. Fat substitutes like that grew in popularity around the world in the 19th century. Compound lard was another big substitute in the same period. It was made of tallow and cottonseed oil. When fish and chip shops opened in London and Lancaster for the first time in the 1860s, it was compound lard that they used to fry everything. Those fats were always a bit uneven and unpredictable at first, and not particularly attractive to look at or smell. But scientists soon discovered hydrogenation, the process of saturating those oils with hydrogen, and that gave them a solid consistency. They looked better and they became even more popular. These developments were mostly taking place in Europe, but American scientists would soon catch up in the race to develop new foods. Gail Borden was an American newspaper publisher and land surveyor, but in the 1850s he invented a process to can and condense milk. And Borden's became the most well-known brand name for the process. You see Borden's condensed milk even today. That development spread to lots of other industries. Many companies had learned how to can soup in the 19th century. It wasn't very hard. But the problem with canning soup is that it's bulky. It's mostly water, so it's heavy, and it's expensive and not very efficient to ship. So in the latter half of the 19th century, the Campbell's Soup Company created a new technique to condense soup and then to ship it around the world. You've undoubtedly been the beneficiary of that technology yourself. Out west in California, there was a big boom in farming in the 1880s and 1890s, with the rise of bonanza farms that were enjoying major gains in agricultural productivity. But even with refrigerated rail cars, it was nearly impossible to send greens across the country to growing markets in the Midwest or the East Coast. But in 1903, plant breeders solved this problem with the invention of a new green, iceberg lettuce. Didn't have a lot of taste, but it was basically indestructible, and that was its big selling point. There was a similar process taking place in the world of grains. In 1921, the Taggart Baking Company in Indianapolis, Indiana, debuted its new invention, Wonder Bread. It was soft, it stayed that way for a long time, and it came pre-sliced, so it was the best thing since bread. Before long, American bakeries were in a crisis mode. They were losing out to this newly popular, mass-produced industrial bread. And similar inventions were remaking the American breakfast table. Before the 20th century, Americans broadly ate things like porridge at breakfast. Sometimes they had bacon or eggs. But at the turn of the century, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg created cornflakes as a cure for the patients he was treating at a Seventh-day Adventist sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. Before long, his brother William began marketing this new food to the public as a quick and easy breakfast. Soon, a former patient of theirs, Charles A. Post, got in on the action. He founded a rival company which sold a kind of cereal beverage that they called Postum. In the early decades of the 20th century, Americans began eating cold cereals for breakfast, but not everywhere. American Southerners continued to hold on to their regional preference for stone-ground corn grits instead. Consumers responded to these new products in really different ways. Some of them, of course, were really popular, but they often made consumers anxious. People didn't know where these foods came from, and they couldn't assess the purity for themselves. They didn't get to see any part of the process. Before the rise of self-service grocery stores, they had to trust a shopkeeper to help them find the right products. This new age of consumer anxiety stoked a few different interventions. The first was a massive commercial revolution in the late 19th century, with things like retailing, advertising, and marketing. This started out in the realm of stores. In the 1890s, Thomas Lipton built an empire of grocery stores that sold mostly canned goods. Later, the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company opened what they called economy stores throughout the United States that later would just be called A&Ps. These stores were one way for big industrial manufacturers to connect with consumers who otherwise would have been really distrustful of these new foods. Some of these companies carved out big promotional empires for themselves. H.J. Heinz, whose name you've probably heard, was known for his 57 varieties of canned foods. But he mostly became a marketing pioneer for the advertising gimmicks that he used. He gave out miniature pickle pins, and he sponsored a pleasure pier at Atlantic City. The National Biscuit Company, later known as Nabisco, undertook a lavish promotional campaign for their Unita cracker. It was an era when companies began to realize that they didn't just need good products, but also big marketing budgets too. But even big marketing campaigns couldn't totally reassure people who were suspicious about industrialization. Reformers were worried about the rising power of corporations, and they were suspicious that big companies would take advantage of their growing power by undercutting quality. In some ways, this looked like a return of powerful ideas of moral economy from an earlier period. Citizens had already been wary of some of the compromises that industrial foods required. Canning was invented in France, but it basically didn't take off there since workers much preferred the taste of fresh meat and vegetables. French companies and the French government spent more than a century trying to teach French women about the virtues of canning, while military dining halls worked equally hard to make canned food palatable to French men. American consumers also recognized that refrigerated meats didn't taste quite as good as fresh meat. But in the latter decades of the 19th century, activists became aware that industrial foods weren't always as pure as they claimed to be. Foods were often treated with chemical additives and preservatives. Canned foods were laced with things like copper or tin, and candies were often colored with metal alloys. Most tin cheese was preserved with lead or mercury. Meat was contaminated with borax or boracic acid, an antiseptic that also happens to be poisonous. Activists seized upon the discovery of these hazards by drafting new kinds of food legislation. For the first time, municipal health boards were founded, and they began processes of food inspection in Europe and the United States. In the 1870s, Britain passed what they called adulteration acts to criminalize the tampering of food. And then Canada and Australia did the same things. But the biggest developments took place in the United States in 1905. That was the year that the muckraking American writer Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel which depicted the unsanitary and inhumane conditions in Chicago packing houses. This was supposed to be a book about labor conditions. And he famously said of this book that he had aimed for the public's heart and hit it in the stomach. Audiences were disgusted by his lurid description of meatpacking plants, and they demanded change. A year after the publication of The Jungle, the US government passed a piece of legislation called the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which required the inspection of any food sold through interstate commerce or across state lines. That act didn't always work. It was hard to prove that foods had been adulterated either deliberately or accidentally. And it privileged big firms who could afford the cost of inspection where smaller companies just couldn't. But legislation like this helped consumers feel like they had some say in the new processes which were fundamentally changing the way they ate. To talk a little bit more about the intersection of cuisine and industrial foods, I reached out to a longtime friend of mine, Sandra Dicapua. Sandra trained in Romance language and literatures at Harvard University, and then got her start in the food world working for one of the most important cookbook writers of modern times, Joe Nathan. After that, she worked for a long time at 11 Madison Park, working her way through the ranks from coat check to maitre d' and project manager. Eventually, she was called upon to start a new project called Kellogg's NYC. I reached out to Sandra to talk about industrial foods and their place in modern cuisines.
My name is Sandra Dicapua. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, raised in South Florida. And I developed an interest in food before it was interesting and cool to be interested in food, I think. Always had an obsession with cooking and where recipes came from and where food comes from, and really spent my college years trying to figure out where in the food world I belonged. I wanted to go to culinary school. My parents were like, hell no, get an education instead. But they said to me, like, your time in school is your own. And once you graduate from college, do whatever you want. So I studied Romance languages and literature at Harvard with a focus on French colonial literature. And the summer between high school and college, I moved to Rome, worked at a kosher catering company, and got my feet a little bit wet working in a sort of professional kitchen. The following summer, I worked at a restaurant in Soho in New York. That was my real first restaurant job. And I liked working in the kitchen. It was a very machista environment, but I got a lot out of it. And I learned a ton, not only about cooking, but also about how kitchens run, how restaurants operate, what makes them tick, restaurant culture, which I think is so fascinating. Eventually, what I realized is I wanted to try to marry my love for food with what I had studied in college. So my first job out of college was working with Joan Nathan, who's a cookbook author with a focus on Jewish food. And she was working on a book on the food of the Jews of France. And so I went to work with her as a sort of research and culinary and personal assistant, which was awesome. Spent a lot of time cooking and researching and in the Library of Congress. She lived in Washington, D.C. So I did that. And it was awesome. And then I had another realization, which was like, I really missed the people part. I like working in teams. I like support. I need the motivation from other people. And I decided to go back into restaurants, but this time in the sort of front of house dining room capacity. Got introduced to Danny Meyer. He's most recognizably the owner, founder of Shake Shack, but had a restaurant empire in New York and really the gold standard of what hospitality is. I got a job at 11 Madison Park in 2009 when it was just a French bistro. I started there as a coat check. Then I went to the dining room as basically a busser, back waiter, front waiter, and then I became the head maitre d'. So really welcoming guests, developed this whole system of researching our guests and figure out how to make them have an awesome, memorable experience at the restaurant. And then went through this whole process at 11 Madison Park where they got 4 stars in the New York Times, 1 Michelin star, 2 Michelin stars, 3 Michelin stars, and watch the restaurant take this trajectory to being a fine dining establishment. Then I became the project manager there. So worked on writing a cookbook and then a second cookbook with them, the opening of the Nomad Hotel in New York City, just like doing really cool projects. Wanted to open my own restaurant. Spent a year trying to do that. Didn't work. Learned a lot about opening restaurants and how they fail, which is the majority of them. By chance, met my business partner. We had this opportunity to open a Kellogg's cereal bar in New York City and spent 3 years doing that. I kept kosher till I was 22. So I was limited in terms of what I ate, but I was never a particularly picky eater. And really my parents were adventurous eaters. And so I remember being 15 or 14 or whatever, going to Indian restaurants in Miami and going to Thai restaurants. And that all seems very commonplace now, but it wasn't, right? I had an obsession with food TV, really, and with cookbooks. Ben, you remember that Food Network wasn't what it is now. There wasn't Chopped. There wasn't it was PBS. I was watching Julia Child and Jacques Pepin, and it was like, it was different. It was a very different thing. And my mom had a ton of cookbooks. My mom she was very type A, and she subscribed to Gourmet and Bon Appetit and cataloged them. And so she got them bound and then she would index them. It's like so crazy. But so I would spend time like looking through them. Fast forward to when I was 22, I got a fellowship to go to Japan for 6 weeks and then Southeast Asia for another 2 weeks. And I stopped keeping kosher. I said, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it. Right. I'm going to go to people's houses. I'm going to eat anything. And I really just let loose on everything. Nothing really scared me. In that summer, I had whale bacon, horse sashimi, chicken sashimi, dolphin. I would just try anything. I also have a stomach of steel, which helps. But it also, I grew up in a mix of cultures. I was born in Bogota. My parents were both born in Colombia, but my dad's parents were Italian and Syrian, Lebanese, and my mom's parents were Polish. And so right there, you have 5 food cultures plus the American food culture. But I was the one that was taking, leftovers to school of yebra and lahamajin and arroz and risotto from the night before, whereas everybody else was taking like Lunchables and tuna fish and peanut butter. When I was at 11 Madison Park, what was interesting is that there's two sides of it: what happens in the dining room and what happens in the kitchen. So in the dining room, I got to learn about French techniques because we'd learn about dishes, right? So they would do, for example, lobster tail with the flavors of ratatouille. And I remember this because we would study this and get quizzed on it. So it was a lobster tail, butter poached. Then there were three quenelles. One was a zucchini concassé. One was a red pepper something. One was an onion soubise. And then the sauce was whatever. And then you'd have to learn the wine pairing for it. My parents are not drinkers. I didn't grow up drinking wine, tasting wine. Like Manischewitz was Friday night and that's sort of it. But when you work at 11 Madison Park and they take the zucchini and only take out the inside and then puree, what's left is all the other stuff. And that stuff got fed to us as family meal. And so the dining room experience is like this really elevated fine dining thing. And then in the background, you're having family meal that's prepared by the Dominican porters or the Vietnamese line cook or the Thai pastry chef. What you get fed as family meal is incredible. It was my first time having chicharrones because the Puerto Ricans and the Dominicans would take the suckling pig that was cooked confit for the dining room. They'd take the odds and ends and fry them and you'd end up with cracklings. So that dichotomy, that point of like tension between what gets eaten in the dining room, what gets eaten in the kitchen is so fascinating. And even then I had an opportunity to develop a completely different side of my palate. I left to live in Madison Park with this desire to do my own thing. And I had this dream or this idea of opening a kosher taqueria. And I thought it was an awesome idea. I still think it's an amazing idea if someone wants to do it with me or wants to take the idea for it. I spent a year doing it. I went through the whole real estate process and the ideation and menu planning and concepting and recipe testing and costing. And I went to Oaxaca in Mexico for a month, just eating and trying stuff and learning about heirloom corn and a whole nother foray into food and food cultures that's so fascinating and so rich. And after a year, I was like, it's not right now. It's not right for me. It's too risky. I can't raise the money for it. I can't in good conscience take people's money to do it when it wasn't right, period. But as a result of that, I got some really good skills and someone asked me for some help opening a restaurant in New York and navigating a little of that process. In the process, I met somebody named Anthony Rudolph, who had been the general manager at Per Se, which was 11 Madison Park's greatest competitor. Anthony had been approached by Christina Tosi, who owns Milk Bar. Christina had been using cereal in her Milk Bar creations for a while: cereal milk, cornflake cookies, compost cookies. And Kellogg's approached her to say, how can we reimagine a bowl of cereal? They had done a pop-up with her in Times Square. It was wildly successful, where she came up with these awesome concoctions around cereal. And they said, what would you do next beyond this pop-up? Pop-ups always they have a very temporal sense about them. Physically, nothing's permanent. Like they put fixtures up that are very fake, that are flimsy. And the idea is like Kellogg's is this company that's over 100 years old. Let's do something real. Let's do something with staying power. And so Anthony, Christina, and I came up with this cereal cafe concept. We put it in the center of Times Square as a real cafe. We wanted to make something that felt like a respite from Times Square. So we'd have all these people coming through, but it wasn't bright lights and neon and crazy. It was really just a little bit more homey. We created this cabinet system that was reminiscent of the automats of the early 20th century in New York, but also delivered this idea of surprise and delight. So you'd order your cereal, it came to you through cabinets and a buzzer system, and sometimes we'd put Beyonce tickets into the window as well. We put in the morning newspaper to a guy who worked across the street and was a regular. We'd put in just coloring books and crayons along with cereal. So there was this element of surprise and delight. We wanted to create a really hospitality first experience, having come from fine dining into this fast casual. And Kellogg's got out of it one of the most amazing marketing campaigns in the history of their company. We rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. We were on CBS Sunday Morning, in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal. It was just a sensational experience that companies like Kellogg's had never really done before. And it was a lot of fun. certainly grew up eating cereal, not necessarily every single day, but there was already cereal at breakfast table as one of the choices. My brother Paul was a Frosted Flakes fiend. He came for a run in the morning, coming back eating a bowl of Frosted Flakes. I also know, remember that on our birthdays every year, the tradition was that you got to choose the cereal for the family. So I have two older brothers. On March 5th, I got to choose the cereal that we'd eat. And it was usually something like Lucky Charms or Fruit Loops or something that we weren't really allowed to have other than on our birthday week. My brother Michelle always chose something chocolatey, Cocoa Puffs or chocolate or something crazy like that. My mom eats Special K almost every single day. When you got Special K in the big box, that by the time you got to the bottom, it was too pebbly or too smushed. So she always bought the individual boxes of Special K. I think for a lot of people, it's a point of nostalgia. I think today there's a lot more choices for breakfast. So there's a few things happening. One is that there's more choices for breakfast. Two is this real focus on like whole nutrition. I feed my daughter, who's 3, an egg for breakfast almost every day, or yogurt or chia pudding. And then there's the third element, which is millennials are eating a lot more out of convenience. There was an article I think in the Times about how millennials don't eat cereal because they don't like washing the bowl and they don't like having to do dishes. There's something fascinating there about convenience culture and taking things on the go and the rise of bars and drinkables and things like that. But I think for a lot of the people that came through to the Kellogg's NYC cafe, I was seeing the Kellogg's letters and having like a Proustian moment, if you will, of being taken back to a childhood moment or what it felt like to have breakfast as a family and this desire to have that once again for themselves or for their family. Look, what we did at Kellogg's NYC, I think is really interesting because we tried to marry both sort of the high with the low and make both feel like they could coexist, right? And so the perfect example of that is that there was a bowl that Christina Tosi created called Pistachio and Lemon. So it was a mix of Frosted Flakes and Special K with toasted pistachios, lemon zest, and thyme leaves. And we poured over this local milk, 5 Acre Farms, local New York milk. And I loved the tension that existed in that entire bowl where you're doing Kellogg cereals at their most basic, right? And you're marrying that with what I call the flavors of roast chicken, right? Lemon and thyme and toasted pistachios that when I was doing the procurement, we'd buy the best quality of pistachios. And this local New York milk that we got from small farms and purveyors and providers. And I thought actually that bowl really exemplified my own food culture, where it's a culture of convenience to a certain extent and getting stuff that tastes good and either you have a nostalgia for or is just like a staple and can't be replicated by organic or like a higher end brand with these really high quality ingredients and local milk. And I think that's the reality of it for most of us, or the reality for me, trying to like reconcile both of those. I'm somebody that is a little bit equal opportunity. We buy organic milk, but we also buy, Raisin Bran. So that tension for sure exists for me. But I thought with Kellogg's, there was like something really cool that was done there and especially exemplified in that bowl. I think this fascination with food is here to stay. And I think it's really cool. And I think if you have an interest in food, you should go for it. The caveat is that what seems cool and fun and sexy isn't always, the easiest. I think working restaurant jobs is invaluable. I think everybody should be a waiter or waitress at some point in their life. It's something that people used to do, especially in New York, like you moved to New York and you wanted to be an actor or an actress, you wanted to do something and you'd be a waiter or waitress to get by. It is the most humbling experience. You'll learn a ton about restaurants and food. You'll get access to people and food experience that you would never have before. Now with what's happening with restaurants, which is really heartbreaking and sad, it's going to be a little bit different. I think it'd be fascinating to work at a grocery store. I never did it myself, but that's another thing that I would love to learn about food systems through grocery. How does food physically come in? Where does it come in from? What happens to food when it's no longer on the shelf, when it's either expired or something's bruised? And I think grocery is here to stay in some way or another. I think CPG, consumer packaged goods, is absolutely fascinating. My experience with Kellogg's, dabbled in it a tiny bit, but figuring out what the new food brands are and the new food trends and putting yourself out there to work at a tiny startup or at a company that sort of needs people to just do stuff, knowing that it's not going to be the sexiest work necessarily, but that there's tons to be learned. How do you get a product from a lab into a Whole Foods, into a Trader Joe's? What's the whole process of developing a brand? How do you get eyeballs? There's something really interesting happening now with the way that foods are branded: probiotic, prebiotic, gluten-free, keto. And what does that mean? How do you decipher that? How do you put that in front of a consumer that literally has no clue what any of that means and make them go crazy for it? I'm saddened by what's happening in food. I think there's going to be stuff happening in ghost kitchens. I think there's going to be something happening in soup kitchens, in the distribution of food by mail, in food systems that affect communities unlike the ones that I grew up in. And I think it'll be interesting to see what the next 2 years bring. My greatest piece of advice is don't let anything be below you. I cleaned up vomit from 11 Madison Park restrooms, scraped gum from the bottom of a table, just done stuff that was gross in the moment, but that you did because you had a passion for what you were doing. Nothing should be below you. Mopping, sweeping. There's an amazing story about the guy who invented Flaming Hot Cheetos, this guy named Richard Montañez, who was a janitor in the Frito-Lay factory. The story is absolutely incredible. But to go from being a janitor and taking great pride in janitorial services at a factory to being SVP or VP of marketing and inventing Flaming Hot Cheetos specifically for the Mexican community that wanted something that was more interesting to their palate is one of the most fascinating stories to read.
So let's try to wrap things up. Over the course of the long 19th century, the industrialization of food would completely transform the lives and diets of people in America and Europe. Foods that had been a luxury only decades earlier suddenly became everyday items. The specter of hunger disappeared in many places, but the rise in meat, fat, and sugar in these diets brought new challenges to people's health. People could eat more and more refined foods and sometimes completely new foods, but more of those foods came from factories and carried with them risks and fear of adulteration. This was also the era that saw the rise of modern marketing and advertising, which helped to assure people of the safety of unknown products, but also created new annoyances and a lot of waste. But there were bigger changes as well. Industrialization had major geopolitical consequences. Europeans were more readily able to capitalize on new technologies, and they were able to exploit the agricultural resources of disparate continents. Land across the world was remade by the rise of big wheat and the expansion of grazing fields for cattle. And tropical regions that made things like chocolate, coffee, tea, and sugar were all yoked into the global economy in new and troubling ways. The application of new technologies like the factory, the steam engine, and the refrigerated rail car meant that products could be moved across continents and oceans. So foods in this period for the first time became interchangeable commodities that were severed from the places where they were grown. Pretty soon we'll talk about the massive changes that industrialization would have on the modern world in greater depth, and the rise of what we'll start to think of as food politics in the 20th century. Before that, though, we're going to have to discuss the changes in cuisine that were also taking place in the 19th century, and how modern cuisines were built around the world. We'll pick up that thread next time. Thanks for joining me. See you soon.